We have perfect, thank you. We have Professor Thomas Klak with us. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about our organization. We are the Catons River Education Alliance, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We offer programs, as well as this program, virtual and in-person events at no cost, thanks to the generous donations of our members. So if you are not already a member, we would love to have you join us. If you are a member, many thanks for your continued support towards our programs. We hope to connect people with nature for the benefit of both. Some of the programs that we have to offer here you can see, and we do nature walks. We have 2 upcoming walks this October, which are currently full, but you can take a peek at those on our website. We will have more to come in November shortly. We also offer a summer day camp. We connect with local schools through our educators going in, training the teachers in environmental sciences and hands-on science lessons with their students. And we also have story walks at 2 different locations. One is located in Brunswick, the other is in Topsham. And those allow preschoolers and other age children to get out with their families on the trails, reading books and exploring as they go. And you can see all of these programs on our website. And we also have another virtual event, which is coming up next month as well. That virtual event is Rewilding the Landscape's 10 Easy Ways. And we're really excited about this program. The 2 speakers are from the Wild Seed Project, and you can register for that program right on our website. That is coming up on Tuesday, October 26th at 7 p.m. Tom, I hope you don't mind if I use that photo. So without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Tom Klak. Professor Klak teaches in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs at the University of New England. He's also the Vice President and Gene Conservation Chair of the Maine chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, as well as the Science and Technology Committee member at the American Chestnut Foundation. Welcome, Professor Klak. Thank you for joining us for this virtual presentation.
Jenny, you're muted.
Oh my, we all got muted. We all got muted there for a second. Okay, it was a universal muting. Okay, thank you for
There we go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Should we switch over then? Are you
sure. So I just wanted to add one last thing before we switch screens over. If anyone does have any questions along the way, please just be sure to put those in the chat as we go, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. Now I am going to stop sharing my screen. And you can go right ahead and share yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. Oops, I almost hit the wrong one. Leave meeting. Nope, didn't want to do that. Okay, how's that show up there? All right.
Yes, it looks great on my end.
Okay. And the other thing I would think would be great would be at the end, if people can hold their questions for about 40 minutes or so. And then you can put up your hand and we can have just an interaction that way as well. Wouldn't necessarily have to mean that the questions are typed in. If people want to type them in, that's cool. But if you want to just ask them, we can do that as well. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jenny and Caroline, for the invitation to talk about my favorite subject this evening, which is the American chestnut and bringing it back. Okay, so bringing back the mighty chestnut, and here's the organization of what I'd like to talk about with you the next 40 minutes or so. So I want to give you plenty of information under number 1 about why the American chestnut should be considered a keystone species of the eastern forest, some things about its natural history, its ecological importance, and its cultural importance, both to Native Americans and to the post-colonial population in this hemisphere, in North America. And then so we'll talk about that. Second thing we're going to do is what happened to it. So how did it get rendered functionally extinct by an accidentally imported fungal blight from Asia? And then the main part of what I want to talk to you about is what we're doing to restore the American chestnut to the Eastern landscape using biotechnology. And that's what I work on. That's the science part of my work, and very exciting, I think, breakthrough point in the history of trying to bring back this species, which has been gone from the landscape for many decades. And then we'll finish up with a question and answer session. Okay, so this picture here, I think, pretty much summarizes what I want to say in the next few minutes. On the left side is it's a lithograph, so it's kind of a depiction, but it shows a giant chestnut tree. This is actually in Fairmount Park in central Philadelphia, a typical sort of landscape feature prior to the fungal blights. This would be in the late 1800s. You see a guy up here in the tree knocking down the chestnut burrs, which would be literally happening right now, literally in the next week or so. We've just been doing a lot of harvesting of chestnuts yesterday and the day before. And then everybody gathering chestnuts by very large quantities on the ground. But just look at the scale of the tree. So that's what the chestnut used to be like on both the urban and the rural landscape. That's what we want to restore. This is what the chestnut looks like by and large right now, this middle picture here, a functionally extinct American chestnut. There's still some on the landscape. This tree here, believe it or not, does still have a few leaves. It's very common to see chestnuts looking like this. We call them ghost trees because the wood is able to survive and endure after the tree is dead. It's insect resistant. So this is what we're dealing with. So I like everybody to kind of stare at this very ugly middle picture and ask, okay, what are we going to do about it? How can we bring back the mighty chestnut? It should look like it looks here on the left, looks like this in the middle. And the way we're going about it in terms of the science is illustrated here on the right side of the picture with what we call transgenics, where we've added an extra gene to the American chestnut that gives it one thing that it can't do in nature, which is to fight off the fungal blight. And so we produce pollen on chestnut seedlings under high intensity lights at the University of New England. And that's then the pollen that we take out to the field to find wild trees to pollinate, to give them that extra thing they need, which is the ability to fight off the fungal blight. So that in a nutshell is what we do here in 3 quick pictures. Let me go into just a little bit more detail then on these topics. So let's talk about why the American chestnut was a keystone species on the eastern forest landscape, and why we want to bring it back and all the value it has. So first of all, just to make sure you know what the chestnut is, it's on the left here. So too often it gets confused with the unfortunately similarly named horse chestnut, which is an unrelated species. This is actually a European tree. It's not a Native American tree, but the leaves are quite different, as you can tell. And then the nuts are also very different. So the chestnut, the American chestnut, looks like this on the left. And this is literally what you can find right now in the landscape. So if you know of any wild chestnut trees, now's the time and go to gather the burrs. Wear heavy gloves because the burrs are very protectant of the nuts inside. And then this is the horse chestnut here on the right. Totally different, again, totally unrelated. You can't eat these. These are poisonous to humans, the horse chestnut. These are delicious. They're very nutritious as well. It's a really a wonderful food crop, along with many other benefits. Okay, so there's a bunch of different species of chestnut in the world. They're all part of the beech family, Fagaceae, that includes oaks. So a lot of what we know about chestnuts today, we can study from their relative, the oaks, because the chestnut is not well represented on the landscape anymore. But within the genus Castanea is a variety of different species of chestnut, and the American one is called dentata because it has the most toothed leaf here on the left. There's the Chinese, and that's important because that's been an effort to try to bring back the American by breeding in blight-resistant attributes from the Chinese. The European chestnut is very similar to the American and similarly unable to withstand the fungal blight. And then there's the Japanese tree. The only two large trees are the American, the dentata, and the sativa, which is the European. So one of the problems with trying to bring back the American chestnut by breeding it with the Chinese, which is the Mollissima, is this Mollissima is a short tree. It's more of an orchard tree. And in order to reach the canopy tops 100 feet up or more, it has to be a tall tree like the American or like the European. Okay, so what did it look like on the landscape? Here's just some pictures from a landscape prior to the fungal blight reaching North Carolina. It would have reached not so long, maybe a decade after this picture was taken, but you can just see the scale of the American chestnuts, talking like 10 feet in diameter, massive, massive trees growing over 100 feet tall. Here's some other pictures, similar kinds of things of how big the chestnut was. And here's the map. It's not actually a very good map because the chestnut actually extends further up into Maine than here, and it doesn't actually survive in Western Ohio because the soils are not right. But more or less, it gives you a sense from Maine to Alabama across to Indiana for the native range. Sometimes the American chestnut was called a redwood of the East for its size. In many parts of the native range, here depicted in the green, the chestnut was 1 out of 4 trees on the landscape. Other hardwoods were also large. The oaks were large and tulip poplars were large. So it wasn't only the chestnut, but the chestnut was a mighty tree back before the blight, and estimated up to 4 billion American chestnuts in this native range here in the eastern US. And here's what climate projections, our warming world suggests is going to be the native range coming forward, say only in about, less than 30 years. So the original native range outlined here in black, and then the projected native range. This is if greenhouse gas emissions are minimized. This is if they're not. And so anyway, the point being, we're up here, if you can kind of see the crown of Maine here in the top of this picture. So we would have been on the northern edge of the range during the prior to global climate change and warming, and now we're right in the heart of it. And so the point being is that Maine is a very suitable habitat for chestnuts, really all the way up to the north. And in fact, we have some experimental orchards in the Crown of Maine and Fort Kent, and they're doing quite well up there. So we can kind of think of Maine being very central to chestnut restoration, whereas much of the South, which would have been the heart of the original range, is not going to be suitable. It's going to be too warm for the chestnut. I'm going to fly through some of these slides just to kind of get a feel for some of the natural history and the importance. Now, this is just a comparison of chestnut production, tree production, compared to various oaks, depending on what part of the East you're talking about. Different kinds of oaks would have replaced the chestnut on the landscape, red oak, of course, being one here in the southern half of Maine. And basically what the studies show, even though there's not a whole lot of chestnuts to compare, many more oaks, of course, on the landscape, is that the production of nuts by chestnuts is literally more than 100 times as much as the nut production, the acorn production by oaks, 100 times. So it's a staggering piece of data, but it just shows you the quantity of food that the chestnut would have provided on the landscape, both for wildlife and for people. Again, much of this natural history is just staggering and hard to imagine, but we need to reimagine it. We need to bring the tree back. So squirrels love chestnuts. Again, this is the burr of the chestnut that you can find literally right now out in your area. So I encourage you to go look for it this time and try to find some wild trees. Major important food source for turkeys, for blue jays, for the extinct passenger pigeon, rough grouse, bears. And I love this art. Sometimes the art can show you things better than any science can. And so here you have a picture of a chestnut tree that is literally kind of growing all the wildlife that it fed so bountifully when it was an important part of the landscape. Again, up to 4 billion chestnuts on the landscape. And this little table here, again, we don't have to get too involved with it. This comparison of some of the related species or similar species on the landscape, the beech, the chestnut, hickory, the oak. And the key piece of information here is that the chestnut produces nuts much more frequently than all these others. And basically the chestnut, in my experience of studying them and working with them very carefully over the last 6 years, they produce food, they produce chestnuts every year. Maybe a little bit up and down, but it's every year. It's a guaranteed source. And as you know from acorns, they don't bloom every year. Hickories will have some years and much more other years. But the key thing is that hickory chestnut is a vastly more reliable food source, also quantity, as I indicated in the last slide. So it has those really two important features going for it. This is an interesting comparison where people put out a randomly distributed array of all the different nuts, like the beech nuts and the hickory nuts and the acorns and the chestnuts out in the forest, and then watch to see which nuts the wildlife preferred. And the result of this study was that the chestnuts were gathered first. So the wildlife, even though the chestnut is not frequently found on the landscape, and it's now a rare site to find a large producing chestnut, the wildlife still know it's the best, and they picked it out before all the other food options. So the chestnut was a giant tree, grew quickly, grew straight. The grain was straight, it's lighter than oak, easily worked, rot resistant from tannins. It's got a lot of tannins in it, and that makes it also insect resistant. So much of the chestnut wood can be used the second time. They call that wormy chestnut because of some of the beetle holes it might have, but it doesn't affect the integrity of the chestnut. So it was used for construction, furniture, telephone poles, railroad ties, posts. You can see the railroad car here going by, probably picking up these chestnut logs and maybe moving it out west. And there are still a few telephone poles in New England that are chestnut going back to the 1900s, and furniture production as well. So here's kind of a composite then of all the different roles of chestnut in ecology and in our cultures. Even beer, and obviously turkeys would have benefited. Blue jays are the #1 spreader of and planter of chestnuts, so they're really going to be important for restoration. And even fish, because there's evidence that the detritus of chestnuts is preferred by a lot of insects, and so and then the fish can eat those insects. So fish even are better off if there are chestnuts on the landscape. Kind of a really interesting secondary impact. So that kind of then summarizes this idea of a keystone species missing on the eastern forest landscape. So in terms of the cultural revival of the chestnut, one of the things I'm working here in Saco and Biddeford is to work with an amazing ice cream manager and owner, this guy here, John Denton. And for now this year, for the 3rd year in a row, we're going to be producing chestnut ice cream. And these are chestnuts here that we've sliced, and we've got a system of shucking them and getting rid of the skin and preparing them. And he makes amazingly wonderful chestnut ice cream. So I'll be trying to remember to send the advertisement. We were just talking with him today. We're excited about taking our chestnut ice cream operation to a higher level. And why to do that? Well, everybody loves ice cream, but what we're trying to do is revive the cultural connection to chestnuts that's been lost. We had this conversation 100 years ago, people would be laughing. Of course, the chestnut is so important, but we've lost that and we need to bring it back. And even today, in today's paper, believe it or not, I was doing some news perusing this afternoon, and I saw this article in the Guardian online magazine or newspaper from Great Britain. Go nuts, 10 mouth-watering chestnut recipes from chocolatey eclairs to hearty risotto. And it's interesting that the author of this article steward heritage. So there is a really important heritage to the chestnut. And what he's talking about are the European chestnuts, where they've been able to have much more success in dealing with the blight there than we have had here for good, important scientific reasons. Our tree has not been able to revive, so we've had to come up with a new solution, and I'll talk about that here in a moment or two. Okay, so that's the background why the species of American chestnut is so super important to the eastern US. I'd say it's the most important species, to be honest. Now let's briefly look at what happened to it. How did it become functionally extinct by this accidentally imported fungal blight? So it was first discovered, the fungal blight, it's called Cryphonectria parasitica, in the Bronx Zoo in 1904. We think it was actually in the United States since about 1876, brought in on Japanese chestnuts that people imported, and you can go back to the studies back then to find out what was going on. But people wanted to bring in the Japanese chestnut because it ripens faster. It's a little bit bigger nut, and they said they can corner the market if they can produce these nuts before the American ones are ready. And they, along with the Japanese chestnut and the Chinese chestnut, they brought the blight, the fungal blight that co-evolved with these Asian species that have the ability to withstand the blight, but the American chestnut had no resistance whatsoever. And so the blight quickly spread from the Bronx throughout the native range. By 1950, it had reached throughout the range, killing off up to 4 billion chestnut trees. So we say it's functionally extinct, so it can't play its vital role in the ecology. They're still around across this landscape. We still have chestnut trees. Typically, they're understory trees, they're root sprout trees. They don't produce. We have a few that do produce, but it certainly doesn't play its essential role that it did prior to the introduction of the fungal blight. And so it kind of then ends and leads us to this ethical question. Do these human impacts lead to human responsibilities to take action? I'm a student of Aldo Leopold and his environmental ethics, so I say yes, indeed, especially if now we know through science how to do it. Some people just say, let nature take its course. I'm not one of those, because there are just so many different things that are negatively affecting our natural landscape now. So quick look at what a healthy chestnut tree would have looked like, how quickly the blight could kill it. So this is a chestnut tree in 1910 in eastern Pennsylvania, 1911, half dead, 1910, half dead, 1911, they're cutting the branches off, and then by 1912, the tree was dead. Here's a tree that's still alive. This is in Reedfield, Maine. So there are a few scattered trees. We have a few trees here that haven't succumbed to the blight yet, but we have no strong evidence that any tree can withstand the blight if it gets on the tree. So a tree that's affected by the blight will look like this. It's got this deep wound. It has root sprouts coming up from the bottom as a key feature. And this is what the fungal blight looks like. It likes to find these little breaks in the bark where it can penetrate and get to the living layers of the tree underneath the bark. Yeah, so the fungal blight looks for fissures. It wants to surround the stem and that cut off the roots from the main portion of the tree. But then the tree will resprout from the roots, but then survive as no more than an understory, continually fighting the blight, but then it runs out of resources. And then this is the blight when you look at it under a microscope. And again, sometimes art can tell you the story better than science can. So I like to bring in art as much as I can to understanding nature and understanding ecology. So N.C. Wyeth, a great American painter, did this painting here. He did several chestnut paintings, but this one's called Last of the Chestnuts. And here's some people cutting down their last chestnut trees, just again, right after the fungal blight in 1904 struck. So it's kind of a sad moment where something was so reliable, so important to the landscape is gone, and still gone as of 2021. Okay, so we've lost those connections, those deep historical links, and we need to establish the relationship to the American chestnut. Yeah, so there's still some ghost landscapes like this, ghost forests of chestnuts, that because the chestnut has the ability to withstand insect damage, so the trees can survive and look like these little ghost whitish trees, and they are around if you know what you're looking for. But the other part of this slide is just to note that we're not only talking about the fungal blight that kills the American chestnut, the Cryphonectria parasitica. You know, all these other things are out there too. You know about the gypsy moth and the beech bark disease and the willy adelgid killing our hemlocks, and right down, right? The Dutch elm disease, butternut canker, all of this stuff. These are all imported things, usually accidentally imported things to the eastern landscape, wiping out an array of different wild trees and plants. Some very specific to species, other ones more generalist, like the gypsy moth. So the point is to urge us to take action, urge us to do something about it, because we have so many gaps, so many holes in our eastern forest. We won't get into this picture. This is a study done by the National Academy of Sciences, highest level of science organization. And here's an even longer list of different pests and pathogens that have been introduced to the eastern United States or North America in general. And here's another list of them. You probably know about the winter moth, and so down the line. So we've got the longhorn beetle, all kinds of things reaping havoc on our landscape, and we need to make some very important moves to reverse some of this widespread decline. Even the newspapers are noting this. Invasive insects and disease are killing our forest. We weren't ready for the pandemic, and America isn't ready for the next contagion to strike our woodlands. And you may be hearing about other kinds of, the spotted lanternfly has been in the news coming our way as well. Brought over in landscape rocks from China to eastern Pennsylvania, now spreading across to New Jersey and beyond. Okay, so that's the sad bummer part right there, all the stuff that went wrong and how things have gone awry. Now I want to turn to the main thing to cover here, which is our approach to restoration, the exciting science we're working on now using biotechnology to bring back the tree. Okay, just the scale of importance of bringing back the American chestnut. The rescue and restoration of the American chestnut stands as one of the most difficult, prolonged, and complex single species conservation tasks ever attempted. So an enormous task, many researchers, scientists, as well as volunteers and citizens working collaboratively on the project. But it's a really big deal. If we can do this, it's going to be a major turnaround in North American ecology. So as I mentioned, the Chinese chestnut is a key tree where there's been an effort. I'm not going to be spending time on this at all, but it's kind of noted that there's been an effort to bring back the American chestnut by breeding it with the Chinese tree. So it's possible you may have seen this kind of a picture, that this kind of poster, it's been around for a while, where the idea is to breed the Chinese and the American together and then breed more and more American in as you select each generation for more blight tolerance. The thinking behind this particular approach, again, this isn't the one that I follow now, but it was the idea that there were only 2 or 3 genes that mattered. Well, now we know it's many more genes than that are in the Chinese tree that are part of the resistance that the Chinese tree has. And to breed those over is a really Herculean task, almost impossible through traditional breeding because there's so many genes that matter. So that was the idea, that you're going to have high level of resistance at this level through Chinese hybrids, but we don't have that. So we're working on a different approach. And here's my chestnut burr. And it's really an approach to restoration that has 2 sides of the same chestnut burr. On the one side, we find, propagate, and pollinate wild type American chestnuts. That's nature's genetic diversity. That's nature's insurance, how nature creates mutations and alleles and diversity. And mainly the way we do that is to create these things called germplasm conservation orchards, or GCOs. And this one is in Georgetown, Maine, for example. And so we grow out the offspring of a great variety of wild trees to preserve the genetic diversity in a small area. But even notice here, even within this small orchard that's only 4 years old, the fungal blight has already begun to kill the trees. So very vulnerable, and we're trying to breed them. How are we trying to breed them? We're trying to breed them with a kind of pollen that has blight tolerance, and I'll explain that. So this is the pollen we produce at UNE. It has an extra gene to protect the tree from the fungal blight. So these are the moms then, the natural wild trees that we find and we propagate, and then the dad side comes from the pollen that we produce in our greenhouse and in our lab at the University of New England. The chestnut is bisexual, but it doesn't pollinate itself. You need 2 trees in order to make reproduction. So here again is what we're looking for, and you can find them right now on the landscape. Chestnut burrs are ripening and are beginning. Those should be opening like this very, very shortly. So the next week or 2 is the time to find wild chestnuts. Okay, so let me explain briefly what this biotechnology approach to chestnut restoration involves. It involves inserting a wheat gene into the American chestnut through using a naturally occurring bacteria. It's called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. And so there's been, how does it work? Well, let me just kind of explain it. So this transgenic tree it's got about 35,000 plus genes that are the pure American genes, but it has this one extra gene. So it's by statistically an American tree plus 1 gene. By testing it has the blight tolerance of the Chinese tree. This is the kind of tests that have been done through my collaborators at SUNY ESF, Environmental Science and Forestry College, where the insertion of the gene happened. And so here are pure American here are the ones with the extra gene, here are the Chinese. You see the American can't survive when they've been introduced to the fungal blight. So these then in here start out as clones. So a lot of the work we do is trying to diversify these clones through breeding of more and more lines of pollen and through breeding out in the field. So right now, this biotech chestnut, this transgenic chestnut, is federally regulated. Everything we do is done under permits. We petitioned for deregulation. So it's through the USDA, along with a couple of other agencies, EPA and the FDA Food and Drug, and they are assessing whether there's any plant risk. The research as to whether there's any risk of our transgenic chestnut has been done, and I'll give you a slide or 2 on what the kind of research that's been done to see the off-target impact. But about this gene that we've used from wheat, it's actually a very common gene in nature. So all kinds of different plants, whether they're wild plants like in this right column, or food plants that we eat quite regularly like strawberries and peanuts and bananas, here they have that same gene that is a common gene for protection against a variety of different fungal infestations. So it's common, but not found in Castanea, in the genus of chestnuts. And in fact, the list gets longer and longer of different plants that have that same gene. It's quite common, but again, not in chestnuts. Switchgrass, azaleas I have the gene as well. So plants are trying to protect themselves. Okay, so off-target impacts. What happens when you insert this extra gene? That's been studied quite thoroughly over a number of years at ESF in Syracuse. So bumblebees use the pollen the same way they use the wild chestnut pollen. Tadpoles use the detritus leaves just like they use the wild. In fact, that we found kind of surprisingly and interestingly that the tadpoles grow faster when they eat wild chestnut detritus or the transgenic chestnut detritus compared to maples and beeches. They grow about 50% faster. So it kind of tells us that wildlife is really missing the chestnut on the landscape they really want to see it come back, and they'll do better. Something went green. What happened here? Why did it? We've just, okay. Something kind of funny happened. I don't know what it is. This is weird. Okay, hold on a second. It's gone off to another screen. Okay, there we go. All right, back to you. Okay, lots of different studies have been done. Won't get into it. The mycorrhizal relationships in the soil are the same when we compare the wild chestnut to the transgenic chestnut, and on and on and on down the list. So it's the nutritional profile is the same. No difference, one difference being that it doesn't die of the fungal blight. Basically, in a cartoon way, this is what happens. The fungal blight uses oxalic acid. It's a very common use that fungi on the landscape use to kill things. But the extra gene uses something called oxalate oxidase to detoxify this fungal oxalic acid, and therefore keep the tree from being killed by the acid. And then there are off gases being some carbon dioxide and some hydrogen peroxide. So that's in a nutshell what happens with this extra gene. And so we take plants, then we subject them to speed breeding, high intensity lights, in order to produce the pollen. Here on the right, and the pollen is actually incredibly tiny, very, very tiny, microscopic size. It blows on the wind. Pollination in nature happens by wind. Very little is done by insects. The female flowers don't have much of a scent. So we produce pollen like this at the University of New England, and we collect it. We put it on microscope slides like you see here, and we store it. And we store it in these containers, 4 slides per container, and we put it in a deep freeze at -80 Celsius. That's -125 Fahrenheit. And we keep it until we need it in July when the female flowers are ripe. And so we did some back of the envelope calculations that we actually have enough pollen in our production here at UNE to pollinate 34,000 wild chestnut flowers. So we're doing pretty well in terms of pollen production under high intensity lights. We test the pollen to make sure it's good, that it's viable. In these tubes coming off of the pollen grains, it's 100 times magnification, shows that indeed our pollen, even though it's been stored in the freezer, is viable. Then we take the pollen on microscope size slides out to the field. Again, permitted conditions, places that we've gotten permits to continue to move the science forward and collect our data, done a permit from USDA. So we put this on female flowers in the field. And then we pollinate some wild trees. These are large surviving wild chestnut trees. We put bags over them to contain the pollen. And this is exactly what we were doing yesterday when we were harvesting the bags and to get these crosses between the wild female flowers and the blight tolerant pollen from our lab. And in these germplasm conservation orchards, I was mentioning, this is that same orchard I was mentioning to you in Georgetown. So we're beginning to get some crosses. Some of these 5-year-old trees are beginning to produce flowers already, and we are putting the pollen on them and creating crosses from a variety of different mother trees from across the native range. These trees in particular, you can see, are actually from Ebden, Maine, which is far up on the northern end of the range, which is really important because these trees actually behave differently. They leaf out earlier, and they produce flowers earlier than all the other more southern trees. So these are really kind of quintessential Maine northern edge trees. So we're very excited to produce some crosses and giving them that extra gene to protect themselves from the fungal blight. Then we test the nuts in our lab at the University of New England, and we can tell whether the particular nut has inherited the gene. 50% theoretically will inherit the gene because it's only on one side of the chromosome. So half of the pollen grains will inherit the gene, and half of the pollen grains will not inherit the gene. And so this sample here of a little piece of the nut we've cut off has the gene because it's showing the emission of hydrogen peroxide that turns the sample black. And then this side did not, this sample from another nut did not inherit the gene. It could be a full sibling of the other one. These are important too, because we want to grow these two nuts out in the field to see how they do and see how this one performs in the field compared to its full sibling here on the right. So we're interested in this. Plus, this is a 100% wild individual. So this one doesn't have the extra gene. So it's a cross between a wild, and that's a valuable continuity for the species. I must thank my students at the University of New England for doing so much of the work. And we grow out the nuts in between February and May in greenhouses at the University of New England. And they're tended to by students. They look very happy, as you can tell, to play a role in ecological restoration. And then this summer, for the first time ever in New England, we planted our first transgenic chestnut orchard in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. And so these then are 550 seedlings that we started in a couple greenhouses at UNE and planted out. So they are then the nuts that were tested to inherit the gene for blight tolerance, but they're also a whole wide range of different controls. So we have Chinese chestnuts in this mix. We have 50-50, half American, half Chinese chestnuts in this mix. We have the hybrids that are 94% American, 6% Chinese, to see how those do in comparison. And we have those full siblings that are just like the transgenic seedlings, except they didn't inherit the gene. So we're doing a full-fledged field experiment, comparing them all mano a mano, and seeing how they do and whether the lab results can be replicated in the field. So that same orchard surrounded by deer fencing here by late July looked like this, and we were removing the tubes, letting the trees be free and be open to the wind, build up a healthy stem. And then just recently, just maybe a few days ago, this is what that same orchard looks like. And you can see some of these trees are already 3 feet tall. So they're doing really well. If the mice haven't girdled them, and they have done that to some of them, I had quite a mouse outbreak I had to deal with, but you can see some of the trees are doing really well. So it's going to be a nice comparison. And a chestnut is a very fast growing tree if you can give it good sun and good soil conditions like this site. So again, back to this picture, the state of Maine is crucial to the future restoration of the chestnut. We're really in the heart of it. And again, I'm almost finished here, so we can turn to our discussion and your questions. Just to try to imagine what chestnut restoration on the Maine landscape might look like. So we've got an experiment going on where we plant some of our offspring, just wild trees for this experiment. We put them in these tubes so the deer can't mess with them, and let them get up to be 6 feet tall, and then the deer don't like to eat beyond that. And we're planting them in these little sort of small fingers of forest opening. So a sustainable little pocket, a sliver, a finger of forest is sustainably harvested. It opens up beautiful light for these trees, for these chestnuts, and then the chestnuts would be really great occupiers of that forest opening. And these are just 3-year-old trees. You can see they're about 12 feet tall already. So they grow fast under nice conditions. Okay, so again, back to the original point. This is what the chestnut used to be like on the landscape, what we're trying to redo for future generations. This is what it's like now, and this is our solution, or part of our solution, at least in terms of the fungal blight protection here on the right. So I'd like to turn to the final section then, the question and answers. And I think maybe if I've given you any excitement about this project in the American chestnut, you might be asking, well, what can I do to help restore the American chestnut? So I can answer a couple of those questions quickly. One thing, you can become a member of the American Chestnut Foundation, total voluntary group. We have a Maine chapter. There are 16 state chapters throughout the native range. You can go to it at AACF, American Chestnut Foundation.org, ME for Maine. You can find the Maine chapter website very easily that way. We have a quarterly journal that keeps you up to date. It comes along with the $40 membership. We have a chapter newsletter, and we have various kinds of volunteer activities that you can help out on if you'd like to, and we'd encourage you to do that. The other thing you can do is find and collect fertile wild type chestnut burrs for genetic conservation. We're always looking for the wild trees that are out there that we don't know about. Now is literally the time to find those. Plus they're also good to eat. So two reasons to go out and find wild trees. You can plant seedlings of wild American chestnuts. Even though the blight tolerant tree is not available yet to the public, we're seeking deregulation. We're confident that we will get deregulation in the future when the agencies will grant that. But in the meantime, it's very much worthwhile to grow the American chestnuts. It preserves the native genomics. It's also fun, and it also teaches you about how to grow, the do's and don'ts of growing chestnuts. And we do an annual sale, which you get either from the Ellis Nursery up in Hudson or at the Viles Arboretum in Augusta. And so the information comes out through the chestnut newsletter and through the chapter. You can get that again through our chapter membership. And you can also volunteer to help on these orchards, on these plantings, on the management of the trees. If you're interested, here's my contact information. There's always more work to do, tklak@une.edu. And in the same way that these blight tolerant seedlings here in my greenhouse await out planting in what's now New England's first blight tolerant chestnut orchard, I await your comments and questions, and I thank you for your attention. And I'll stop sharing the screen. Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat room, but like I was suggesting, we could also very easily take your questions, and Jack is the first one to jump right in there. So just so you know, you can go to the reactions little button on the bottom right side of your screen, and then under reactions, you can see there's a raised hand. So if you do that, then you can get in line, and Jack and David are in line. And I guess, Jenny, maybe you could help me by reading the chat questions as well and work those into the conversation. Okay, Jack, all yours.
So thanks for a really terrific presentation. My first exposure to chestnuts came in Maine. It was in Washington, Maine, when I was in Camp Madomic. And there was a large chestnut, the first one I've ever seen, that was by the tennis court. And that's where I learned to play tennis. So I have great admiration and affection for Maine and for the chestnut because of that experience. So I did have a couple questions.
And that would have been out there on the edge of the native range, way up there in the beyond the native range, really.
Well, maybe that's why it was as big as it was. It was probably 50 or 60 feet tall.
And why it survived. Yep.
But my question is, you alluded to 8 different genes that were important, I think, in the Chinese, and yet you're focusing on a single one. I just wonder if you can help us understand how this can be. How can there be, there's redundancy certainly in Mother Nature, but 8 and you got it down to 1. I mean, that seems remarkable to me. Right. And I just wonder if you could sort of predict where the whatever the process is, the EPA, or where you are with that, and when you expect an answer there.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry if I'm glad you brought that up, Jack. It's a great question. And I didn't mean to suggest that there are only 8 genes in the Chinese chestnut that matter. In fact, there are 12 chromosomes on all the chestnut species, and 9 of the chromosomes, 9 out of the 12 chromosomes, have regions of the Chinese chestnut that are involved in blight tolerance. So it's a very complex, probably dozens of genes that matter on the Chinese chestnut. So and that's typical in coevolution. So when the Chinese tree, which has been separated from the American tree for 40 million years, when that Chinese tree co-evolved with the fungal blight, it developed a very nuanced, complex way to protect itself. That's completely different method than we're using, where here we know that there's a different way to protect a tree or protect any plant from a variety of different fungal infections, and that's to use this certain gene that's called oxalate oxidase that detoxifies the oxalic acid. So it's a completely different mechanism, and part of our field trials is to see how it does. Is the one gene enough to protect the tree? The lab evidence suggests that it is. We're beginning to get field evidence that the reduction of the oxalic acid is enough for the tree to callus over. And so that'll be something we're testing, but it's a very different mechanism than the Chinese tree uses. So it's a great question. David?
Would I be able to grab one?
Okay, sure, please, yeah.
Great.
And then David after that. Yeah.
Sure. So someone had said that they didn't realize, didn't really know what was meant by a keystone species. Could you define that?
Yeah, that's meaning a particular species that has an inordinate role, positive role on a whole array of other species. So, I mean, just the metaphor then is the keystone arch, that key stone at the top of the arch that without it, the arch crumbles. That's what we're talking about. So an especially superordinate species that that when it's missing from the landscape creates a vast ecological hole that has not been able to be filled. And again, just trying to imagine, and it's almost impossible for us to imagine here in 2021, but what it would be like if the food supply that are provided by acorns, say, on the landscape were 100 times that much, the benefits to wildlife and people that kind of food production would provide. It's hard to imagine. So it's vastly important. It's also a later pollinating tree, so it produces pollen in July, where many other species are early pollinators. So it provides kind of a gap pollen source. They talk about the hillsides snowing in July when the chestnut was predominant. So all of those kinds of things make it especially important. And that's why we're thinking, why do we target this one species? If we can bring it back, the widespread benefits across Eastern North America are probably as great as anything we can do in terms of bringing back another species that's lost. Well, I'm going to go to David.
Yeah, I'm a native Mainer who's been in Ithaca, New York for the past 25 years. And I fell in love with planting chestnut trees 3 or 4 years ago, and have planted a bunch every year. Under the influence of some locals that grow mostly what I believe are Chinese hybrids, I have been under the impression that those were likely to be blight resistant. Now I'm really wondering whether I should be planting, native Maine chestnuts instead of these chestnuts I've acquired from other.
Yeah, and that would be answered by depending on what your objective is. Yeah, so basically, in order to have a tree you can plant yourself that has enough protection from the blight, it's going to have a substantial proportion of Chinese genes. And so you're bringing over enough of those genes in that complex multi-gene defense system of the Chinese in order for the tree to survive. So if you want a tree to survive right now, you can breed it with the Chinese. It's not going to be the restoring tree of the forest that we need. It's not going to be a canopy tree, because the Chinese tree is an orchard-sized tree, and the American tree is a dominant, canopy tree that reaches 100 feet or tall. So there's quite an industry of chestnut production in the United States, nowhere near the size that the European producers have, but it's here, and the way they do that is to breed it primarily with the Chinese, and also or the Japanese, because the Japanese tree also has resistance. So you can do that. You can produce nuts, but it's in order to retain the wild genes, we need to be perpetuating the wild trees that are still out there. And that's where, again, what's a special part of the approach that I'm part of is that we're producing half of our offspring, half of our nuts that we literally collected yesterday have the gene which will protect them from the blight. We hope. The science says so far, yes, it will, but we're testing it in the field. And the other half are just wild types, and we're preserving the pure American heritage for future science. And we'll know a lot more than we know now in 5 years, in the same way that we wouldn't have had this same conversation we're having right now 5 years ago, because the genomics that we've done and uncovered the complex genomics of the Chinese tree, for example, we didn't know that 10 years ago. So the genomic revolution in medicine and in science in general is really changing our capacity and our understanding to do good things. And so that's the path we're on.
So I have a quick couple of follow-up
David.
questions. Actually, will the Chinese hybrids go wild? And what are the consequences of that for the forests of Maine, for example?
Yeah, the chestnut, that's one of the questions that the USDA is really interested in, and we've provided a lot of data on that. The chestnut is not an aggressively spreading tree. Why? Well, for one, it's so delicious that all the nuts get eaten up. And for two, our deer population is going to browse down everything else that happens to grow up. That's why you saw one of those pictures of my work where we use these 6-foot tubes to keep the deer from chewing it down to the nub. So it's not, the chestnut is not a tree that is going to aggressively swallow up the landscape. It was actually the last hardwood tree to repopulate Maine after the glaciers. We have that from the pollen records. So it's going to need a lot of effort. It's going to need effort by volunteers, like hopefully yourselves and many other people and people beyond us. It's going to be a many decade project. So I wouldn't worry about it spreading around. And the other thing is that since the Chinese genes produce a shorter tree, it's not going to be a tree competitive in the forest that can reach the canopy level. So I wouldn't worry about that, David.
Here in Eco Village, we have a reforestation project that is trying to create a food forest with a lot of chestnuts in it.
Good.
How do you value that compared to native chestnuts in the wild?
Yeah, I mean, there's a role for all kinds of different chestnuts depending on what you're wanting to do. And so, yeah, there are commercial producers, and again, they would have to have a substantial amount of Chinese genes in order to produce and not succumb to the blight. So yeah, there's plenty of room for different approaches. But if we want to bring back the keystone species, then the way we're working on it seems the best path forward to retain as many of the wild genes as possible and to give the tree the one thing that it can't do in nature. So that's the way we're going in terms of the science. So great questions. Jenny, I see a bunch of different.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, David. Jenny, maybe you could go to another one of the chat questions, please.
Sounds great. What do you imagine the biggest challenges will be to reintroducing such a large tree on a large scale?
Yeah, a lot of volunteers for sure. It's, there's an old Chinese saying that we always repeat that society grows great when old men like myself grow trees that they know they won't sit in the shade of. So it's a many decade solution. All we can do is do our best to try to give that the initial boost in the direction of bringing back the tree. And there'll be a lot of trial and error. but growing them in different ways. I mean, to me, that I mentioned the blue jay. The blue jay is number one. No animal spreads the chestnut like, or any nut like the blue jay. The blue jay will bury individual nuts. It doesn't cache nuts like a squirrel does. So the blue jay can spread nuts across a radius of 2 kilometers from the initial source. And then it doesn't remember most of them. And you might think, well, that's pretty dumb. You try planting 10 chestnut. I tried this myself. Try planting 10 nuts in your backyard and then go back the next day and see if you can find them. I tried it myself and I failed miserably. So the blue jay will find maybe 40% of its nuts and it won't find the other 60%. And those then will be hopefully ones that, I mean, yes, the deer are going to browse them down, but and we have too many deer, especially south of us in more urbanized New England. So that's going to be a challenge for restoration. So it's going to be a lot of trial and error to do that. But I do look forward to the day when we're able to share the result of our science and let people grow trees that won't die.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Next one was, how old would a 10-foot diameter historical chestnut have been?
Yeah, they can live hundreds of years. Again, similar to the oak, we know a lot more about the oak. So you can think about the oak. An oak tree is unless we cut it down, because we cut down trees very quickly. And that's, we just don't really know what a wild tree looks like because our forests are so young. But a naturally occurring oak will have a 300-year time frame where it's growing and it's expanding, and then a 300-year time span when it's stable, and then a 300-year time span where it's declining. And you think that's hard to believe, but that trees can grow easily over 500 years if we let them, and that's what the landscape looked like back in 1600. There are chestnut trees in in Europe, not in India, in Europe that are 1,000 years old or more. So again, what nature is capable of is really mind-boggling to us, because we look out our window and we see a tree that might be 2 feet in diameter and we think it's so big. That's really an adolescent tree. So the primordial forest and the forest we want to aspire to try to push towards is vastly bigger than that. Do you want to take Carol's question, Jenny, please? And then back to your.
Sure, go right ahead.
Yes, Carol, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a volunteer with Great Pond Mountain Conservation Trust in Orland, and a team of volunteers and students from Kids Peace over the years have planted really quite a large number of chestnuts, American chestnuts on the property. And I wasn't involved with those earlier efforts, but we need to do some maintenance on the trees that are out there. Some of them are probably maybe 15 feet tall. Some of them are a lot shorter. A lot are still in cages. Do you have advice on how those trees should be managed? Like, for example, in terms of pruning, I think they've got a thin bark. Is it better to not prune, to prune?
Yeah, where did you say there was?
And
Carol? I missed just where you're located.
This is in Orland, Maine, Great Pond Mountain Conservation Trust.
Okay. Yeah, there's tremendous resources to support the kinds of questions you have, Carol, and they're great questions on the American Chestnut Foundation website, so acf.org, and you can find out a lot of things, the do's and don'ts. One thing I would be careful of is if you are planting pure American trees, if you cut a branch off, you are opening a wound that the fungal blight can get in. So I would discourage any pruning of pure American trees. If they have a lot of Chinese genes, then that Chinese gene complex can help to defend the tree. They like lots of sunshine. That's number one. They like a soil that's not saturated or with too much clay. So they want a well-drained soil. But in my experience, the number one factor is sunlight. And a tree can is able to withstand the fungal blight infection for a longer period of time if it's able to photosynthesize aggressively. And in fact, there was just harvested a tree on Sunday that was heavily blighted, a couple trees that are side by side in Buxton, Maine, heavily blighted. You could see the generations of stems that have died, yet it was just loaded with burrs. And the key thing, why? Is because it's out in 100% sunshine. It gets full sun all day long. So it's able to photosynthesize and fight off the blight to some extent. But it is a losing battle though. The blight will eventually win. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, Carol, but I'd suggest go into that website of the American Chestnut Foundation and you can find out a lot of support information.
Thank you, will do.
Jenny?
Sure, Tom. So Jim St. Pierre said, how do the chestnuts planted, I believe by Louis J. Lipovsky in the Brunswick Town Commons long ago, fit into the restoration efforts?
Yeah. I researched the Lipovsky chestnuts at one point, and I wasn't able to find out exactly from the historical record what percentage Chinese genes those trees have. But they are hybrids. So they are partially American and they're partially Chinese from what I was able to gather, which is typical. And another one that's the most common kind of chestnut that you see, and they even sell them in some places at Walmart, is the so-called Dunstan chestnut. And that again has a large percentage of Chinese in order to protect it and keep it from dying. So that was the heritage. Yeah, that's the one way to keep the tree alive in terms of available resources. And I think there was a question before about when we expect deregulation. That could happen. It's totally up to the federal agencies. So there's no way for us to predict. We are through a couple of hurdles in terms of the process already. There's been a couple of rounds of petition commentary. There was a very dense 400-page scientific paper that was submitted to document the off-target impacts and the history of the breeding of the transgenic chestnut that I described. That was submitted about a year and a half ago. So that's working its way through the federal agencies. So it could happen according to their time frame if they stick to it as quickly as 2 years from now. Whether that will happen, again, totally out of control. But the path so far has been positive. The response has been positive, both in terms of the public commentary the strong majority has been in favor, and in terms of the agency reactions thus far. So trying to be careful as they need to be in looking at the data, looking at the evidence. And we are working under permit. We have plenty of work to do while we await the federal deregulation decisions. Back to Jenny.
Sure. So this one was from Lisa Ferguson. I'm considering moving my farm to silvopasture. I hope I'm saying that right. By putting trees, how soon will your chestnuts be available for something like that?
Yeah, I wish I knew. Yeah, I can't wait. I get questions like this, once a week or every 2 weeks on where do I get a tree that won't die? And I look forward to the moment that I can provide that. It'll be the greatest moment of my life. So we can't. So we can do what we can do. I'm even imagining that in the orchards of these blight tolerant trees that we're planting, how we're going to dig up every other one and spread them to people that would like to have a tree that is going to grow like the original American chestnut did grow and not succumb to the blight. Was there another part to that? Yeah, we're awaiting. And again, if you would be willing to become a member, then we would keep you up to date on all of this stuff and every step along the way as we move through the regulatory process.
Thank you. The last question I have right now is, do brown tail moths attack the chestnuts?
Yes. Yes. And I happened to head off. In fact, and coincidentally, that same orchard I showed you a couple pictures of in Georgetown, Maine, I happened to be out there 2 or 3 years ago. And it was just looking, and we were seeing these little caterpillars crawling all over the oaks and the apple trees, and then into our orchard. And we had gloves on, but we were squeezing them and taking some pictures of them. I was kind of, in fact, dumb me at the time. I'll never make this mistake again. But they looked like tent caterpillars to us. The nest that they produce on an oak or an apple tree is similar to a tent caterpillar. And so we got back with our pictures, and we found out that it was a brown-tailed moth invasion that if we hadn't caught it, would have wiped out the orchard. It's possible that they could come back, with new leaves, but we would have certainly set the orchard back. So yes, they love to eat chestnut leaves like they do. They're a real generalist, invasive pest. And be careful, don't do what I do. Don't squeeze them in your hands, because they can give you a really horrible rash. We were lucky we avoided that.
I got a few more questions in after that one. So this is from Bruce Wilkins. Randy Martin is working with them in Presque Isle. Are you familiar with his work?
I've been hearing about that project, and I know the president of our chapter, Al Faust, is involved. I'm really excited about that project because we want to continue to test the chestnut in further north conditions. Just like I mentioned, we have a bunch of chestnuts growing very happily up in Fort Kent. I don't know if I mentioned that already, but that's an exciting project. So it looks like the habitat is throughout Maine is suitable for chestnuts, again, with the warming conditions that we all are experiencing. So yeah, I'm excited about the Presque Isle project. My understanding is that it's a combination of pure American seedlings that have been planted, along with some hybrids that have Chinese genes. And put them in the ground, see how they do. That's where we are in terms of our restoration project at this point in time. Great project.
And one from Lisa. This is, can the general public come visit one of your orchards, especially the one with all the varieties?
Sure. Yeah, that's why I left my email address. Just contact me. Be nice if you would be willing to help out, because there's always work to be done. And so volunteers are coming out just to build that acre site with the 8-foot deer fence around it. We had like over 40 volunteers that worked over a course of a 2-week period to do all of that, and then get the 550 plants in the ground. So there's work to be done there as well as at the university. So please contact me. It's tklak, T-K-L-A-K, @une.edu. Jenny, will that contact information be available maybe at your website, so people want to follow up? I'd be happy to.
Absolutely. And we'll send an email with your contact information, as well as the websites you shared again.
Because only through people like yourselves are we going to be able to accomplish bringing back the chestnut tree. We can do quite a bit of the science, but much of the legwork is through community volunteers. That's how things actually get done, and that's the future. Carol, I didn't know if you still had a question. You have your hand up still. If not, maybe you can put that down unless you wanted to follow up. If anybody else wants to ask a question out loud, please put up your, you can find the hand signal there under reactions, and we'll turn to you. Otherwise, Jenny, is there some other comments that we want to go to?
I don't see any other questions. Lots of thank yous for this excellent presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the excitement that my team and myself, my students, tomorrow I'll be in the lab with my students. They're so excited about it. We will be doing some experiments along the way, testing the nuts for the presence of the gene, testing our system of applying pollen with the microscope slides, which thus far is foolproof. It does not pollinate beyond the individual flowers that we've targeted. So we did a big study of that last year. We're going to replicate the study this year. continuing to produce pollen. So it's a very exciting student engagement project. Again, anybody that would like to see the operation and volunteer as well, would be very happy to have you join us.
Tom, we had one more sneak in if you have
Okay.
time
Oh,
for
yeah,
it.
please. Happy. If I know people have to go.
Yes.
And
This is from Rob. There are a couple sellers of American chestnuts that claim finding huge trees and replanting seeds, selling the offspring. TY in Georgia is one. Sorry, my question just jumped. Any work you know of with these potentially resistant trees?
No, there's no scientific evidence that the pure American tree has the ability to withstand the fungal blight. That makes it a little bit different than the ash and the elm, because both of them, there are a few surviving individuals that have some ability to tolerate their invasive pathogen, but not the American chestnut, partially because there was a massive tree cut down operation going on when people discovered the blight. And so amongst those 3.5 billion trees, there could have been some out there potentially that maybe would have a mutation, but those are gone. So we don't know of any way for the wild tree to survive on its own. It's just a matter of whether in time the fungal blight will catch up with the trees. We have a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of a leeway here in Maine with our colder winters and our trees more spread out. And so the blight is not as geographically aggressive here as it is in the South. And it's interesting, Georgia was mentioned because I sent some of my pollen down to the University of Georgia last June for pollination, and they have only 2 trees. They only have 2 trees that they could pollinate because all of them have been wiped out by either the fungal blight or another fungal disease that I didn't even mention, which is a root rot disease that they have down in the South that is coupled with, so they have 2 fungal diseases down in the South killing their trees off. We don't have this, what's called Phytophthora root rot up here in the North yet. It's spreading northward, and we're working on breeding our pollen with the fungal blight resistance to hybrid trees that have been demonstrated to have a resistance to the root rot. So that work is going on as well, and hopefully produce a combination of blight tolerance. But in Georgia, there's just very, very few, or in other places in the Southeast, they have very few wild trees left. So we're really much more fortunate up here. Massachusetts in particular actually has the greatest number of wild trees surviving.
And one more, this could be our final question. Where is the largest chestnut tree?
Oh, great way to end. So of course, Maine is number 1. So the largest, tallest, well, I should say the tallest American chestnut tree in North America is in Lovell, Maine, and it's 115 feet tall. So it's quite a specimen height-wise. It's growing amongst a pretty dense canopy of white pine trees. So it's not a very wide tree, and it's actually surprisingly kind of skinny for its height. It's not really, it's not a massive 5-foot wide diameter tree, but it is the tallest one that we know of. So us chestnut enthusiasts kind of make a pilgrimage over to Lovell to see the giant that has managed to survive. So that's number 1, and there's a few other ones that are around that are still big trees. But we want to have a lot more of them on our landscape, and we'll do our best to bring the tree back for our children, our grandchildren. I hope you can be part of that, and we can pass forward that legacy of bringing a really crucial ecological element back to our landscape that really has so many holes right now. And the last thing to mention is that the kind of science we're doing with the chestnut has a lot of relevance to these other species. So we're learning a lot about how pathogens work and what are the options for dealing with them. So the approach that we're using by using this naturally occurring bacterium that invades other species, agrobacterium. I mentioned that's one approach. That's one tool in the toolbox. There are other approaches, and there are other ways to deal with the plight of native species. So we need a big toolbox. We need a lot of options, and we need to consider what's going on in any particular species that that we can use to do what we need to do, because we have the science, and I feel we have the ethical responsibility to reverse so many of the problems that we've not purposely, mostly inadvertently done by bringing in pests and pathogens mainly from abroad, and that our native trees and plants simply can't deal with, or if it's things like Asian bittersweet, just end up gobbling up the landscape, as I'm sure all of you know, just by looking in your backyard. Japanese barberry, knotweed, so many of these things are just replacing our native species, and therefore replacing our insects, replacing our birds, and really harming and devastating our ecological relationships that we all need. We all need to survive. We need pollinators to produce our food. So ultimately, our own benefit, but it's really the benefit of all 10 million species on Earth, is really needing us to try to reverse the widespread devastation. And we can do it. And it's
that is the perfect segue to our October speaker, which is we'll be hearing from the Wild Seed Project about rewilding landscapes. And I've put a link to register for that, but it's, the chestnut was native, and we need more natives in our landscape. So thank you so much, Tom.
They're so beautiful. They're so fun. It's just amazing thing to do is to grow natives. So yeah, that's really great that you guys are putting on that. And it's a really great organization. And I'm part of that organization, and I support them very much in their agenda.
Well, I saw in the chat, Tom, that at least one person is going to join. So
good. Thank you. We appreciate it. We're volunteers.
I'm a proud member of the Maine chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, and hopefully you'll get some more converts and some volunteers. So thank you so much for the work that you do and sharing your information and expertise, and most importantly, your enthusiasm.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and to chat.
Great. So we've recorded this, and we'll be sending a copy of the recording out to everyone who's signed on. So if you missed part of it, or you want to forward it on to someone else to listen to, please do. And thanks everybody for coming.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.